right, this is part 4 for the lecture on state repression. We left off last time talking about some of the benefits of having a democratic society to prevent or reduce the amount of abuses that go on by the government. According to the research, this isn't what I think or somebody else, but what the data indicates looking at countries around the world. This next point here is that the fact of less repression in democracies, democratic societies, is called the domestic democratic peace. So that's just saying that there's a certain payoff, a benefit to societies being less abusive if they're societies that give people an opportunity to vote and to have some input in the running of their government. Research shows that democracy does not decrease, I should say, repression until it is fairly advanced. The road to more democracy can bring more repression until mature democracy is reached. So this is a point that I made earlier, and maybe it's put a little, I don't know, maybe a little more clearly here, but maybe not. So let me restate that you see the worst abuses in the middle. Where a society is transitioning, it's not quite democratic yet in a mature, developed way, and it's no longer autocratic and really top down. It's moving in the right direction, but you often see with important social change and social transitions that there's sort of a chaos during the transition. Going from the old ways to new ways can be very disruptive. And so you can get governments overreacting or turning to state repression and abusing its citizens as it's trying to head towards in a democratic situation and kind of falling back on its old ways of violating human rights, that sort of thing. So this period of new move towards democracy brings this ironic consequence. And so we want to get societies to where they're maturely democratic, but that's not always easy, and there's a lot of growing pains there. Now, we also see that poor countries tend to have more repression, and this is consistent with both of those theories we talked about before, the deficiency model and also the rational choice model, that if you have fewer resources, you have less leverage, less something that you can use to convince people to go along with the program, to not act in a threatening way, to maintain a peaceful approach to their relationship to the government. Resources help, money helps, and if you're poor, that means that's a form of kind of desperation, that you don't have so many tools in your toolbox to use to influence people and to neutralize threats that you perceive out there in society. So this is due to more grievances, fewer alternative ways to control the population. Now, that control of the population, again, sounds a little bit harsh to me, but from both of these perspectives, the deficiency model and the rational choice model, that's what governments are doing when they act repressively and harm citizens, is that they're trying to neutralize perceived threats. So both of these theories sort of have a pretty almost, I guess you could call it almost a dark view of how government works and what it's trying to accomplish, that it is trying to keep the population peaceful and controlled and keep peace and order in place. Repression gets used by elites to protect exploitative relationships. Now, this is something that we haven't stressed in this lecture too much. I should stress it here, that a lot of times what motivates people to fight against the system, to pose a threat to the government, to challenge the government in violent ways or threatening ways, is perceived injustice. You perceive that your group is getting the short end of the stick, is not getting fairness, is not getting justice. That makes people angry. And so their perceived injustice is a real driving force between populations getting, citizens, the ordinary people in the country, getting them riled up and acting in a way that threatens the government. And so now, of course, I use this term perceived because justice is often in the eye of the beholder, and what you think is just may be different from what I think is just. But still, that's key. If the citizens perceive that they're getting the short end of the stick and that they're not getting a fair process or fair results from their government, then that sense of injustice makes them angry. That's where anger comes from, is from feeling that you're getting exploited, you're getting taken advantage of, that you're being treated in a way that's unfair. And then anger leads to challenging, threatening, violent, disorderly, chaotic behavior. So that I want to stress that I don't have a lot of points on that, but you need to understand perceived injustice drives a lot of this disruptive behavior that the government then feels it's got to clamp down on, that it's got to neutralize. We don't talk about terrorism in this course much at all, because terrorism, at least in my mind, is something that's kind of tends to come up from the bottom. Yes, you can have elite, powerful individuals who are terrorists, but the movement itself tends to be a movement of weak people. It's weak organizations and weak groups that are moving against a powerful established government or governments. And so because of that, I tend to think of terrorism as kind of, since it's coming from a position of weakness and desperation, that's why these terrorists, will attack innocent civilians, is because they're coming from a position of weakness. They don't have the strength to be able to take on an army and the military of an established government, because they'll get destroyed if they do that. They're too weak. So they do these sneaky tactics of attacking innocent civilians, easy targets, that kind of thing, because they're coming from a position of weakness. So we won't talk about terrorism in this class, but it's actually worth a moment for me to mention terrorism, because it is violence, it is abuses and takes the lives of innocent civilians. So it's worth mentioning, but just understand my reasoning for why I won't be stressing that topic in this class. But indeed, the point I'm making here is that terrorists, they perceive that their people, whoever they're representing, they think that they're being mistreated and that they're being treated unjustly. And so their violence and their terroristic actions, they see as retaliation, as payback, as evening the score for what they see as injustices that they've suffered. So a sense of injustice drives a lot of this. And this is why it's important for a government to do the best it can to make people feel like they're getting a fair shake, like they're getting fair, just treatment. That's an important thing. And perceptions are important. People's beliefs are important as well. So a couple important points there. Let's see. Some research shows that extensive international trade and investment tend to reduce repression due to external pressure. Some believe the reduction comes through economic growth and an expanding middle class. Okay, so now this is only some research, so I'd say this is more of a mixed finding, but one strategy that countries will use, so let's say the United States sees some country around the world abusing its citizens, abusing its people. Let's say, for example, maybe in China, there's human rights abuses. In Hong Kong, let's say that there's human rights abuses. There's kind of different schools of thought. Well, what do you do with a country that's not treating its people well? Do you refuse to have anything to do with them and simply condemn their bad behavior, or maybe boycott doing any business with them? Or how far do we take this? Do you go to war with them in the extreme situation, in the most extreme scenario, if they're acting badly towards their people or some of their people? So there's a range of things you can do. And one school of thought is that, well, if you reach out and have more positive relations with this bad behaving country, you do business with them, you trade, you do things like student exchange, where you have their students come over here and study in the United States. The idea is if you're friendly and you interact with them and do business with them, that you grow on them. They start to think like you do because of your contacts. And I think a lot of the belief behind that is that if our way is superior, if our way of doing things and treating people well is attractive, then is a really good way that they're going to see that as they have contact with us and experience things with us, they'll say, wow, those Americans are really right. We should do things like them because that's the right way to go. So you do have that school of thought that if you reach out and have positive relations with other countries, that those other countries will reform. And so that's a sort of a positive way of looking at things. Of course, there's some evidence that it can work, but also sometimes it may not work, because some people, at least some people would argue, using this U.S.-China comparison, that we've done a lot of business with them for decades, and yet you still see a lot of abuses over there. And so it could be that a country will benefit and take advantage of doing business with you and having exchange with you and open positive relations, but it may not change their mind about things at all, and they'll enjoy the benefits but not change, and so you end up actually potentially in a worse situation, because you have a society now that's more powerful than it was decades ago, and it due in part to its working with you working with them and exchanging and doing business, and that they profit from that. But then don't change, so they're just as bad as they ever were, but more powerful now. At least that's the criticism of this kind of approach. So international treaties only reduce repression if enforcement is tough. So you sometimes will see countries come together and make treaties in favor of certain human rights and against violations of human rights. And a lot of times people will do that as sort of a moral message they want to send to countries that are behaving badly. But what the research seems to indicate is if you just get together and sign a paper with a bunch of different countries and say, okay, this kind of behavior is bad. Let's say, for example, one of the topics we'll talk about this semester is modern day slavery. So if a bunch of countries come together and they condemn modern day slavery, that doesn't work very well unless there's some enforcement, unless a country faces penalties and punishment and consequences for bad behavior. They tend not to change just because you disapprove of them or you sign a paper that condemns certain things that they're doing. That doesn't tend to be enough to work. You need to have something with teeth in it. In other words, that there's consequences, that you're going to pay a price if you violate the rights of your people. Then there's going to be a price to pay. And if there's a price to pay, then it is more likely to be effective to get people to straighten out. An example of this might be, say, like South Africa, when decades ago you had apartheid, where there was separation between blacks and whites, and blacks did not receive equal treatment. And so you had countries all around the world not only condemning South Africa's apartheid, segregated sort of behavior, but you had countries, companies, businesses who would refuse to do business with them and boycott them and make it hurt and come up with ways to inflict pain and quote unquote pain, difficulties, consequences on South Africa. And you see that they reformed, that they ended up making a more equal society due to pressure from countries like the United States, European countries, and individual actors, individual organizations, that kind of thing, or from around the world. So anyway, you need to have enforcement according to the research. Okay, and so that does it for this first lecture on state repression.